Hi everybody, thanks very much for watching. Today I'm going to take you through very quickly a revision video for the problem of evil and suffering. So this is year 1 philosophy. So we're talking about the problems, the responses and evaluation of the responses. So as you probably remember, the problem of evil can be broken down into several problems, and there are also quite a few different responses that you need to know for the exam, but I'll take you through it as we go along. Okay. So the first bit that's worth knowing before we really get into it is a little bit of biblical background to the problem of evil. So what does the Bible say about evil? Now, you're not going to be asked a question on this, so they can't set a question specifically on what does the Bible say about evil. But it is worth knowing because it's going to help you with this. It's also going to help you in general with Christianity, and especially with dialogues, because you can then kind of blend that knowledge together. So there's quite a lot in the Bible about evil. The one that probably comes to mind first is right at the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. Now, there's different views within Christianity about how true that story is, whether it's literally true, whether it's metaphorical or allegorical. But it is about evil, it is about sin. And it does seem to be suggesting in some ways that evil is all the fault of humans, because God creates Adam and Eve, puts them in this perfect situation. They rebel against God, and this brings sin into the world. And obviously we see that then play out in the development of thinking, particularly in the Catholic Church, but also in other Christian schools of thought as well. We've got stories such as Noah's flood, particularly, but also a little bit the story of Job. We're going to come back to Job later because it's a little bit more complex. But to make a long story short, with Noah's flood, God essentially decides to wipe out the entire human race except for Noah and his family. Now, again, this could be a metaphor, it could be a story from a different tradition that got adopted in a different way. But that suggests that God is using suffering for his own purposes. So he uses evil and suffering as a kind of tool of control or tool of dominance. And then we have Satan being introduced in various places in the Bible. This has a bit of a connection to free will, because we have Satan being presented possibly as a being that has rebelled against God, which is sort of backing up this idea that God creates beings with free will. But then you could also respond to that and saying, well, you know, God put up with that. God allows Satan to control evil. Does that mean that God is therefore responsible for controlling evil? So it's not straightforward at all. But the good news is quite a lot of what you need to know for the exam is fairly straightforward. This is quite a big topic, and what I'm going to say in this video will not be everything you need, but if you use this as like a starting point for your revision and then go back to your books, back to your notes, you should be absolutely fine. So, a few basics. We've got natural and moral evil. So these are two types of evil that you need to be clear on. Natural evil is stuff that is not our fault, stuff that we cannot control. So when a natural disaster happens, like an earthquake, humans suffer, obviously, in many cases, but there's no intent behind it. There's no human intention that causes that. Certain diseases, genetic mutations, again, things that we can't control. The suffering that occurs in nature. So when a lion takes down an antelope and eats it, that's not the fault of humans. I say certain diseases. There is a little bit of overlap into moral evil, because you could argue that some diseases are caused by human factors and human lifestyles. So that brings us into moral evil. Hurtful, harmful acts done by humans, generally with the intention to do harm, or possibly through ignorance or negligence. Now, moral evil is on a massive sliding scale, from, you know, being a little bit mean at one end of the scale, all the way up to full-on genocide and everything in between. Many scholars believe that natural evil poses a greater philosophical problem than moral evil. What I mean there is that the responses that we look at, the theodicies that we're going to look at, many of them do a better job of solving the problem of moral evil than of natural evil. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because when you're writing or thinking about the problem of evil, you need to remember that it's more than one problem. We've also got evil broken down into two different philosophical problems as well. So rather than just two types of evil, we've also got two actual problems of evil. So this is the logical problem of evil. So we've got it set out as the inconsistent triad. This is a version of the logical problem of evil that Epicurus came up with. You don't need to remember Epicurus's name, but this is where we get it from. So very simply put, God is omnipotent, God is omnibenevolent, evil exists. Logically, all of those things can't be true at the same time. So we have it broken down a little bit here. If God wants to prevent evil but he can't, then he's not omnipotent. If God is able to prevent evil but he's not willing to, then God is malevolent, so not all loving. Even you could go so far as to say that God is cruel. And if God can and wants to prevent evil, then there should be no evil, but there clearly is. So this is based on the idea that we can't really deny that evil exists. It clearly does, and therefore that gives us a logical problem to think about when we're talking about certainly the God of classical theism. Okay, the evidential problem of evil. This is talking about not just the facts of evil, but the amount of it. The fact that we have so much. So in other words, even if we could think of a good reason for God to allow us to suffer sometimes, and we probably can, that's not very difficult to do, but why so much evil? Why does there have to be such a lot of it? Why does it have to be so intense? Why does it have to be so full on and constant? So you've probably come across The Brothers Karamazov, which is a book by Dostoevsky. It's a novel, it's a fiction book. So be careful when you're talking about this in essays, because you don't want to talk about Ivan Karamazov as if he's a real person. He's a character that Dostoevsky uses. And in the book, Ivan is saying that if suffering is what you have to, if that is what gets you your ticket into heaven, he wants to give his ticket back because he doesn't think anything could be worth that. That's a theme we'll be returning to later. We can also talk about the pointlessness of evil, because even if we can argue that we can learn from evil, well, we don't learn from a baby deer dying in a forest fire all on its own, which is William Rowe's example. And we don't learn from things like mass extinction events that occurred before humans were even on the earth. So, yes, we could say that some evil has a purpose, but not all of it does. And this is also a problem for another aspect of God that many Christians believe in, which is God's omniscience. If God knows everything, then God would have known what would happen. If God's designing the universe, setting the laws of nature in motion, and creating humans with a certain nature, he would have known what we were going to be like. He would have known how it would play out. And yet he let that happen. So again, that's bringing us back to big questions about the nature of God. So let's talk about the responses. So a response to the problem of evil is called a theodicy. It's a particular type of argument. So it's an attempt to reconcile the existence of evil and the existence of God. It's an attempt to show that you can have both. Essentially, it's a defense of God. Okay. Now, there are three that you will need to know. There are three that they can set questions on. There are a lot more than three that are commonly used, But the three you need for the exam are the free will defence, you need John Hick's soul-making theodicy, and you need process theodicy. So let's get into them. All right, the free will defence, generally speaking, says that we can solve the problem of evil by arguing that moral evil is the price we have to pay for free will. And we do have to pay that price because we have to have free will. Our lives would be infinitely less valuable if we didn't have free will. We'd just be puppets. So suffering is worth it. And for us to be absolutely truly free, God cannot intervene to stop us doing acts of evil. Just to illustrate that second point for you, imagine that you had a parent following you around everywhere, preventing you from ever making a mistake, constantly controlling all your actions, making sure that you were wrapped up in cotton wool, that you never got hurt, that you never did anything stupid, essentially that you never suffered. If you think about it, you probably wouldn't actually want that. So this is making the argument that a life where we have free choice, free will, is infinitely more valuable than one where we don't. And because being free means that we have the freedom to get it right or get it wrong, sometimes we'll get it wrong. And God can't and shouldn't intervene to stop us doing that. So that's the general gist of the free will defence. In some ways, that's actually all you need, by which I mean that you don't specifically need Mackie's version, but it's a very, very good idea to know Mackie's version, even though you won't be asked questions directly on it. Here's what Mackie says. First thing you need to know about Mackie is he doesn't actually think this is a good argument. He's a bit unusual because he sets this out so that he can knock it down. He's not a religious believer, he's an atheist. But he set this out. He said, God creates humans with free will, hypothetically, so that we can take moral responsibility, so that we can be free moral agents. This gives us choices, and suffering gives us a chance to respond well. So when we see somebody suffering, if we're free to choose how we respond, we can respond with empathy and compassion. But because we're free, we can also choose not to do that. We can choose to respond with spitefulness or hate, or we can pile on and increase that person's suffering. Because we're free, we can therefore develop love and compassion, which he calls second order moral goods. These are what Aristotle might have called virtues. And these help us to maximize first order goods of happiness and pleasure. And first order goods is anything that makes you feel good, anything that makes you feel happy, which you could argue is a really important part of life. So this is how Mackie sets out the argument. But as I say, the question will not focus on Mackie. If you get a question on the free will defence, you can absolutely talk about Mackie. I would think that would be a really good idea, but you can't be penalised for not mentioning Mackie. If you do a really, really good job of talking about the free will defence without mentioning Mackie, that's still fine, but this is still really helpful. So let's evaluate that. First of all, Mackie doesn't think it works. He doesn't think that the free will defence is valid, and this is why. He thinks that if God was truly omnipotent, he could have created truly free beings who would always freely choose the good. And if they did, that would get rid of evil. God didn't do this, so that suggests that either God couldn't do it, he didn't want to do it, or that he doesn't exist, none of which are consistent with the idea of God. But Plantinga, and this is another name that it's useful to know but you won't be asked, Plantinga thinks that Mackie's wrong because he thinks there's a logical problem with that. It's impossible, logically, to imagine a world with genuine free will, where you can genuinely do whatever you want, but which is also causally determined by God. So if God is making you do something, you're not really free. So Plantinga could well be right about that. He does seem to be right to say that Mackie's being illogical. But what you've got to remember is that still doesn't actually mean that the free will defence is any good. It might be, but you've got to make up your own mind about that. The free will defence has got quite a few assumptions in it. We may assume, for instance, that freedom makes suffering a price worth paying. But again, Dostoevsky does a great job of disputing this through the character of Ivan. If the price we have to pay for going to heaven, being with God at the end of our lives, is a life of terrible, terrible suffering, and unfair suffering as well, it's not even as if it's evenly spread, is it really fair to assume that that's worth it? Ivan didn't think it was. Next theodicy, this is a much more recent one. John Hick is a 20th century thinker, but his argument is actually adapted from a much older theodicy, which came from Irenaeus, who was even before St. Augustine, very early in the church history. Hick's theodicy is very interesting. He thought that the purpose of human life was to grow spiritually towards having a perfected personal relationship with God, and this is fully realised in the afterlife. So hardly anyone gets there in this life. It's too much to do that. But the purpose of our life is to mature spiritually, to grow towards what God really wants us to be. But for us to do that, it can't take place in a paradise, because we can't grow if we're never challenged. And also, epistemic distance is a really key part of this. You'll have come across epistemic distance before. It's this idea that we can't fully know God. So Hick believed that God did that very deliberately. He set up an epistemic distance between us and him, because if it's obvious that God exists, faith doesn't mean anything. We can't choose to grow towards what God wants for us if we know exactly what that is, if it's obvious that God exists. So he borrows a line from John Keats, the poet, and he sees the world as a vale of soul making, like a place of spiritual development. But humans can only develop and grow spiritually if we suffer, because it's only by experiencing suffering that we can develop second order moral goods. In other words, if you never see anyone in pain, you can't learn compassion. If you never experience fear, you can't learn to be brave. This is the radical bit of Hick's thinking. He's a universalist. So he doesn't think that God condemns anyone to hell. There's no such thing in Hick's thinking as an eternal punishment. So this suggests that he thinks soul making can continue in the afterlife. And his view of the afterlife is not exactly the same as the Christian view of heaven. So this is quite a big departure. This is quite a big step away from traditional Christian beliefs about heaven and hell. And for some people that's a strength, but for many Christians that's a big problem with Hick's thinking. So a little bit of evaluation. Epistemic distance totally makes sense for explaining human suffering. We have to be at a distance from God. But epistemic distance is also just for humans, because Hick believes humans are made in the image of God. Therefore, what about the deer burning to death in the forest? What about animal suffering that nobody learns from? He doesn't do a great job of explaining what the point is of that. There's also an argument to be made that soul making doesn't justify the worst evils such as genocide. So in other words, you can't, it would be really callous and really crass to say the Holocaust did a great job of teaching us a lesson. That would be awful to say, because that diminishes the terrible loss and suffering that took place there, and also suggests that we did learn a lesson, which you could argue that actually we didn't. Hick agrees. He thinks that would be awful, and he points out that actually, even if God did stop genocide, we'd just make this argument about something else. We'd make it about murder, or we'd make it about cancer or something else. If God gets rid of the worst evil, we'd just fixate on the next worst evil. Hick's thinking does blow quite a lot of holes in Christian teaching. So if he's right about the universalism thing, And if everybody is saved, if nobody goes to hell, if everybody gets to go to heaven in the end, this undermines a lot of Christianity. So, for instance, why did Jesus have to die if we all get saved anyway? Why did Jesus teach about the parable of the sheep and the goats if there's no hell? And there's another problem as well. Hick very much argues that this is his own faith, and he thinks that from his own experience and his own faith, there must be something in the afterlife, whether it's heaven, whether it's some kind of future state that makes everything that we have to go through worthwhile, worth it. But could that be naive? Could that be a little bit simplistic? I mean, in the horrific example of parents who've lost their baby to cancer or who have lost a young child to cancer, what could you possibly say to those parents? Oh, it'll all be made up to you in the afterlife. What could possibly happen in the afterlife that would make that okay? So even if Hick is right that there are better things ahead, is it a little bit simplistic to suggest that that makes up for what people have to go through on earth, particularly when it's so unfair? So the last one you have to do is process theology, the Odyssey. Sorry. So this comes from Griffin, amongst others, and it comes out of process theology, which is something you'll have looked at in Christianity. This is a modern sort of reworking of Christianity, but it does reject quite a few Christian beliefs, particularly about God. So in process thought, God and the universe exist panentheistically. They exist within one another. So because of this, God can't be transcendent. God isn't outside of time and space. God isn't outside of the universe. He's within it. A good way to think about this is the relationship between God and the world is a bit like the relationship between a mind and a body. The mind has got a certain amount of control over the body, but not entirely. So for instance, you can decide that you're going to go for a run, but you can't decide if you're going to have a cold. That's not within your control. Some things are, some things are not. And so it is with God and the universe. God can persuade, but he can't control. He can't make things happen. He can only carry out this process of bringing order to chaos, but he's not omnipotent. So because God can't control things, there is a certain amount of chaos, and suffering arises out of this chaos. But this doesn't undermine that God loves us, because it means that God suffers when we suffer. He is the fellow sufferer who understands. For many people, that's very comforting. But as you've probably guessed, for Christians, there's a lot of problems with this too. So, first of all, if God is not omnipotent, straight away many Christians would say, well, that's not the God I believe in. That's not a God that would be worth worshipping. And I found a quote from a guy called John Roth, who said that good though he may be, Griffin's God is just too small. So most Christians, most theists, you could argue, would just not recognise the God that's being described here, a God that doesn't have control over the universe, that doesn't have control over our lives. And we've also got the question of, why did God even start on this project of trying to persuade the universe into order when it would bring so much suffering? It would also, wouldn't it be better if we didn't exist at all? Obviously, we wouldn't experience joy either if we didn't exist, but depending on your perspective, you could argue that the suffering of creation outweighs the joy that creation experienced. Would it have been better if God just hadn't bothered? So finally, we've got some implications for religious faith. Now, you've probably worked out evil and suffering is probably the number one cause of atheism. It's a huge problem for faith. It's a huge challenge for people's faith, and people who have a faith have to think very hard about how they're able to have faith in the face of such suffering. none of the theodicies is perfect, obviously, because no argument really is. But they've all got good bits. And many Christians kind of take the bits that they like, but they also take a bit more of a pragmatic approach, which is rather than thinking, let's figure out the problem of suffering, they tend to go, let's do something about the suffering instead. So many Christians feel that the best thing they can do is, rather than agonize over the philosophy of it all, they should just help wherever they can, in keeping with the example set by Jesus. Whatever else you can say about Jesus, he did go around trying to prevent and stop suffering. A lot of Christians kind of prefer not to engage very much in this. They believe that they must simply trust that God has a higher plan, which is the point of the story of Job. In the story of Job, Job goes through terrible suffering, but he never loses his faith in God, and ultimately he's rewarded for that. Another example of that is the crucifixion. Jesus trusted at the moment of his greatest pain that it was all for a higher purpose, that God had a plan. And if you believe the stories in the Bible about the resurrection, that was proved right. Jesus was vindicated in that view. So many Christians take a message from that and say that in the face of suffering, you have to just kind of double down on your faith and just believe that God has got this and that you can't understand God's purposes. Essentially, suffering isn't there for us to figure out. It's part of life. We have to live that life, but it doesn't need to be necessarily a barrier to faith. However, that can also go the other way, and it can be a huge barrier to faith and can lead to many people losing their faith. There isn't an answer to this, but that's okay, because you're not going to be asked to write an essay solving this problem. You're going to be asked to discuss the possible solutions to this problem, which is much, much easier. Okay, thanks for listening to that. Like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share it with anyone who you think would be interested. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.